Hi there, I'm Karthik Chaithanya. I'm junior at KL University from branch CSC. Today, I'm gonna give a brief on 2D physics concepts in Unity. We know that objects in real world get affected by collisions, gravity, friction, and other forces. Similarly, in a game object also must be affected by collisions, gravity, friction, joints, etc. So, these are the main physics materials in Unity: rigid body, collider, hinge joint, area effector, distance joint, point effector, bouncing and sliding. So what is a rigid body? It is a component which tells physics system that this game object is a non-deformable object which is affected by forces like gravity, linear drag, angular drag or any other physical forces and can participate in collisions and creating joints. So what are its properties and the factors affecting it? So mass. Mass indicates weight of the object in kgs and gravity in the game is considered. So drag or damping indicates resistance to linear velocity and is used to slow down the motion of a game object. Angular drag. It indicates resistance to angular velocity. It is used to slow down the rotation of the game object. And gravity. It indicates whether the game object is affected by gravity or not. Kinematic. It indicates whether the body is affected by physics or not. So coming to the constraints. Freeze position and rotation. Freeze position. It is used to enable and disable the motion of object across XYZ axes. Freeze rotation. It is used to enable and disable the rotation of an object across these X and Y and Z axes. So collision detection. It is a corrective failure used to solve collisions, miss errors, or very fast object. Discrete. Continuous set to object to which fast object hits. Continuous dynamic set of fast objects. So collider. What is a collider? It is an invisible shape used to handle collisions between game objects. So types of colliders: circle collider, box collider, polygon collider, edge collider, capsule collider, and composite collider. So what is a circle collider? The circle collider is a collider for use with 2D physics. As its name implies, the collider shape is circle and is given a position and radius in local coordinate space of a sprite. Box collider. A box collider are rectangular cuboids and are useful for items such as crates, chests. However, you can use it as a thin box or as a floor or as a wall. So polygon collider. Polygon collider is a component for use with 2D physics. That collider shape is defined by a free-form edge made of line segments. So edge collider. Edge collider is a 2D component and is a collider for a use with 2D physics. This collider edge need not completely enclose the area, and for example a straight line or an L shape. Capsule collider. A capsule shaped primitive collider. Capsules are the cylinders with a half sphere at each end. Composite collider. A composite collider is a 2D component and is a collider for use 2D physics. Unlike most colliders, it does not have a definite inherent shape. Instead, it merges with the shape of a box collider, polygon collider that you set it up to use. The composite collider 2D uses the vertices from any of these colliders and merges them together into new geometry controlled by a composite collider 2D itself. So hinge joint. Hinge joint allows a game object controlled by a rigid body 2D physics to be attached to a point in a space and which it can rotate. A rotation can be left to happen passively or can be actively powered by a monitored torque provided by a joint 2D itself. You can set limits or prevent to hinge from making a full rotation or make a single rotation. So its properties: anchor motor, use limits, angle limits, brake force, brake torque. So anchor, it defines where in terms of x, y coordinates on a rigid body 2D, the endpoint of the friction joint 2D connects to the game object. Motor. To perform motor changes and its settings. Use limits. The limit to rotation angle. Angle limits. To set limits of use limits is enabled. Set the lower end and upper end of the rotation arc are allowed by this limit. Brake force. To specify the linear force level need to brake, therefore delete the joint. Infinity means it is unbreakable. Brake torque. To specify the angular level needed to brake, therefore delete the joint. Infinity means it is unbreakable. Area effector. Area applies force within an area. When the source collider is triggered, the effector will apply the forces wherever the target overlaps the source. When the source collider isn't a trigger, the effector will apply forces whenever the target 2D is in contact with the source only. This effector is designed primarily to work with source collider that are set as triggers so that target collider can overlap and defined area. So properties. Angular drag. The angular drag to apply rigid bodies. Drag. The linear drag to apply the rigid bodies. Force angle. The angle of force that is applied. So force magnitude. The function is the magnitude of the force to be applied. Force target. The target where the effector applies any force. Force variation. The variation of a magnitude of force to be applied. Use global angle. Should the force angle use global space? Yeah. So distance joint. Distance joint is a 2D joint that attaches two game objects controlled by rigid body physics and keeps them in a certain distance apart. So properties. Connected body, auto configure connected anchor, anchor auto configure distance, brake force. Connected by rigid body. These fields specify the other game object that distance joint connects to it. If this is left as none, the other end of the distance joint 2D is fixed at a point in a space defined by a connected anchor. Auto configure connected anchor. Game object this distance joint 2D connects to. If you enable this, you don't need to complete the connected anchor fields. Anchor. In terms of xy coordinates on rigid body 2, the end point of the distance joint 2D connects to the game object, connected anchor. The xy coordinates on rigid body, the end point of the distance joint 2D connects to the game object, auto configure distance. To detect the current distance between two game objects and set it at distance that distance joint 2D keeps between two game objects. If you enable this, you don't need to complete the distance field. So distance. Specify the distance and distance joint keeps between two game objects. So brake force. Specify the force level needed to brake, therefore, and delete the distance joint. Infinity means it is unbreakable. So point effector 2D. The point effector 2D applies a force to attract ripples against the source point, which can be defined as the position of a rigid body or the center of a collider used by the effector. When another target comes into the contact with the effector, then a force is applied to the target. When the force is applied, how is it calculated and can be controlled? Colliders that you use with effector would typically be set as triggers. So that the other colliders can overlap with it and have forces applied. However, non-triggers will still work, but forces will be applied when collider comes into contact with it. So properties. Collider mask. The mask used to select specify layers allowed to interact with the effector. Force magnitude. The magnitude of the force to be applied. And variation. The variation of magnitude of forces to be applied. Distance scaling. The scale applied to the distance between the source target. When calculated the distance, it's scaled by the amount allowing the effective distance to be changed, which controls the magnitude of force select. Drag and angular drag. Linear drag is to apply the linear drag to rigid bodies. Angular drag to apply angular drive to rigid bodies. Force source, collide and rigid body. The force source is the point that attracts or repels target bodies. The distance from the target is defined from this point, collider. It is the source point and is defined as current position of the collider. Rigid body. The source point is defined as a current position of rigid body. Force target. The force target is a point on target object where effector applies force. The distance to this source is defined from this point, collider. The target point is defined as current position of the collider. Applying the force here can generate torque. Rigid body. The target point is defined as a current center of mass of a rigid body. Applying the force here will never generate torque. So force mode. How is force mode calculated? By constant. The force applied ignoring how far apart the source and target are. Inverse linear. The force is applied as a function to the inverse linear distance between the source and target. When the source and target are in same position, then the full force is applied, but it falls off linearly as they move apart. Inverse squared. The force applied is a function to the inverse squared distance between the source and target. When the source and target are in the same position, then the full force is applied, but it falls off square as they move apart. This is similar to real world gravity. So that's it for the PPT talk. So coming to Unity, I have already placed a car and its road in a scene. So let's see whether it works. Even though scripting for its movements, on clicking arrows, the car doesn't move. So we have to add rigid body component to the car. To add rigid body, click on the car. Go to add component. Go to physics 2D, rigid body, and set the gravity scale as 0. Save it and run. So the car moves now. It goes forward, backward, turns right, turns left, goes the other ways, and goes backwards to left and right. So the problem is it's going away from its road. So let's make the car rigid and make a wall for the road. So click on the car. Go to add component, physics 2D, and click on polygon collider. So we can see it already kept the outline as a rigid body. So save it. Now click on the road. So go to road, add component, physics 2D. So now add edge component. So adding the edge collider, go to edit collider and you'll see a line over here. Place this line over the edges and extend it to till the where you want. I've extended up to here, brought it up to here. So this makes it easy while using these things. So click on the road again, add component, physics 2D, edge collider. Open edge collider, edit collider. So you can see this line over here. So place it over here. Extend till the place you want. So done. So now let's save it and play. See. Now the car gets hit and bounces back. On the other side where I haven't added the edges still remains the same. So This concludes my session. Thank you.